Welcome back. In this lesson, I want us to look at getting input from the user. Previously, we have only been looking at displaying output to the console. So let's change that. So let's start. So what we want to do, there is a pattern that we follow when we ask for input from the user. And so step one of that pattern is to create a prompt. All right. And a prompt is nothing more than using cout and a message. And for example, let's say we want to enter a number. Ask the user to enter a number. We'll simply say enter an integer. Okay. In this case, we're asking for an integer. Okay. Now I'll put a colon and then I'll put a space. And that's the end of the statement. Notice there is no end line. So we are not using ENDL. Okay. Good. So keep that in mind. So the next step in this pattern, okay, remember it's a pattern, is to create a variable to hold the user's input. Okay, we do not need to initialize this variable, right? So we do not need to initialize the variable that will be holding the user's input. And so since we're using an int, we're going to say int user input. We do not need to initialize it. And so that's it. All right. And in the third step of this pattern, we will save the user's input. Okay. And so to do that, we will use the cin construct. Okay. And the cin, simply notice how the arrows are pointing this way. It's pointing to the right hand side, while cout is pointing to the left hand side. So cin requires the name of the variable that you will store the user's input in. And so we'll type in user input. And that's the pattern. 3 steps: a prompt, a variable, and actually storing or getting the input from the user and storing it. Now once we have that, we could do other things optionally. Okay, so we can optionally print the user's input or do some calculation with it. Okay, so let's start off by just printing it. So I'm going to say cout, and I'm going to say something like you entered space, and let's say user input. Okay, and then we want a full stop, and then so I'll put a full stop. And finally, we want a new line, so I'm going to have ENDL. All right, and that seems like a good start. And let's test this. Remember, when you write programs, it rarely ever works on the first iteration. And so we have to always be constantly fixing it until we get it to work. So I'm going to click play. And here, notice, okay, here. Enter an integer. Notice, because I did not put an ENDL, the prompt stays on the same line. And so I'm going to put 44, and I'm going to press enter. And you entered 44. Okay, so that works. Let's go back. Okay, and so let's do something with the user input. So let's say we wanted to find out how old, or let's see what would happen if we added 5 to the user's input. So let's add a value, or let's increment the user's input. Okay, so here's where we can do some calculation. And so I can create a new variable. Let's call it int, and let's call it updated user value. So notice user input or value. So notice my names that I use, that I create for the variables, they're very descriptive. Okay, so I could have put something like x, but it doesn't really mean anything. What does x mean? So I'm going to call it updated user input. Much better name. And so I'm going to say that updated user input will be user input, right? So if you recall, user input will have what the user entered, and then I'm going to add some value to it. Let's add 5. Okay, now this will work, okay, but in programming we want to avoid magic numbers. So we want to avoid magic numbers. Okay, and what are magic numbers? Well, magic numbers are simply numbers that have no context. So if I see 5 here, what does that really mean? Okay, and so to avoid magic numbers, we will create variables to hold those numbers. So I will say something like int increment value, and so that will contain 5. Okay, so I will now say plus increment value. And so you might be thinking, well, that just looks like a lot of extra work. Well, no, right? And I'll show you why it will not be extra work in a moment. Okay, so kind of look at line 18, right? So notice I'm creating a variable and I am initializing this variable. Notice I am creating it and initializing it on the same line. So what am I initializing it with? Well, I am initializing it with the user's input plus this increment value. So whatever we have here will evaluate to some value, and that value will be saved in the updated user input variable. So once I have done that, I can simply do another cout, and I could say something like the number space user input. So the number incremented by, let's put a space, incremented by increment value okay, space, well, not space, but a space is, put a space, and finally its updated value. Then let's put a full stop followed by a new line. Let me get some more space. I'm gonna close this. Let me just close that. Yeah, I have more space. So it's a long sentence, and so I'm gonna put a full stop. And normally I would put a ENDL. Okay. Now, if you want to save typing, then a shortcut for ENDL is to simply put a \n inside the string. Okay, so whenever the compiler sees a backslash followed by an n, it knows not to treat it like a regular n, but to treat it as another name for ENDL. Okay, and this comes in handy because if I want two ENDLs, I can simply say \n, and so the compiler will know to skip 2 lines, and I can do that as many times as I want. Okay, so let me just have 2 lines. So if I wanted, for example, to have a space skipped, then I could do that. And so if I run it, you'll notice that we now skip a space. Okay, so notice we skipped a space right here. Okay, so enter an integer, it's 44. Okay, you entered 44, and number 44 incremented by 5 is 49. And now I skip 2 spaces. Okay. Okay, so that's how we use users input. And back to what I mentioned about magic numbers. What if, for example, we wanted to increment by 10? Okay, the way we had it previously, I would have had to say, okay, we had +5, so I would have had to change this to 10. And then I also would have had to change this to 10. That was 2 changes. All right. But because I don't have any magic numbers, I don't have to go looking through my code to find those numbers. All I have to do is come right here on line 7 and make one change, 10. And that's it. And everything else works. All right, everything else works. And so that's one of the main reasons we don't use magic numbers, because when we have to make a change to our code, we usually have problems, because if we're not sure how many places we use that magic number, where we use that magic number, on how many lines of code, then we can end up not updating all of them, and that means our program will produce the wrong results. All right, so to wrap up, we know how to get input from the user. We know how to not use magic numbers, so we do not want magic numbers. And we also learned how to do shortcut for ENDL. Right? So if I wanted another line, I could just say \n. All right, and notice I was using a lot of spaces here, right? And the reason was because if I don't do that, then the variables and the strings will kind of come together. So let me show that to you. If I remove this, all right, no space, and I click play, and I do 44, you'll notice that it sticks together, right? The number 44 sticks together. So to avoid that, or to fix that, I know that I should have a space, because I know what comes next should have a space. Okay, so I'll leave it here. You can go ahead and practice this program. I'll try to write one of your own. And in the next video, I will give you a problem that I would like you to solve. And then in the video after that one, I will show you my solution to that problem. Great, I'll see you in the next lesson.